You would seldom find anyone in the English-speaking world who hasn't heard of the fictional character Robin Hood or his merry men. But what if I told you that there was a real-life Ukrainian equivalent that roamed the lands of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth? Just as Robin Hood, this man was known as a menace by the nobility, while a savior to the peasantry, for his tendency to take from the rich and give to the poor. Oleksa Dovbush was his name, and his generous actions have led him to become a figure of Ukrainian culture, as well as a symbol of resistance. Oleksa Dovbush was born in Pechenizhin, that lies in the Carpathian Mountains, which, at the time, was part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The political climate during which he was born was turbulent at best, and worth explaining in hopes to understand why Oleksa was pushed to lead the life that he did. Most importantly, economically the Commonwealth was suffering as the price of grain plummeted in international markets, and the Swedish Empire choked Polish trade in the Baltic Sea. And who suffered the most from this? Often the poorest of society, many of whom were Ukrainian, and now pushed further into the depths of poverty. The Polish had also just come out of a period of horrible defeats and loss of life due to conflict, after the Khmelnytsky uprising of Cossacks, the Second Northern War against the Swedes, wars against Russia, and several other civil wars. Obviously, during so much fighting, traditional reserves of manpower were running thin, and a solution was needed to be found soon, or the Commonwealth would fall. So, the King John Casimir II appealed to the peasants to aid in war by promising to abolish serfdom if they joined his army. At the time Oleksa was born, it was 40 years since this promise was made, but due to the internal politics of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the death of Casimir II, nothing had changed, and nothing was going to change. There was also significant turmoil, specifically amongst the Ukrainians of the Commonwealth, who were tired of their overlords for many reasons. Serfdom, for example, which was one of the catalysts for the aforementioned Ukrainian-led Khmelnytsky uprising, continued to be a source of frustration. This practice was particularly hated by Ukrainians, since the promise of abolishing serfdom fell through, and because Ukrainian land had in years past enjoyed a free peasantry. Also, before, during, and after the Khmelnytsky uprising of Cossacks, the Ukrainians went through a cultural reawakening, particularly through the revival of the Orthodox Church in the land. This reawakening caused the Ukrainian Cossacks to slowly ascend and be recognized as the defenders of the Ukrainian people, and, more particularly, the Orthodox Church, which is evidenced by a quote by the Bishop of Kiev at the time, Boretsky. It was the Cossacks' ancestors, the Kievan Rus, who received baptism together with Volodymyr, accepted the Christian faith from the Church of Constantinople, and have been born and baptized, and have been living in this faith until the present day. This new religious zeal was juxtaposed by the efforts of the Poles to colonize the region, in not only attempting to spread Catholicism, but as well by placing Poles in regional positions of power, and by sending Polish colonists to Ukraine. Ukrainians were, in addition, angered by the fact that their people had been divided in two, between the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and Russia in Poland's previous wars. And these two regions were known as the left bank of Ukraine and the right bank of Ukraine, the orientation of which is according to the flow of the Dnieper River. Now, a new Cossack leader, or hetman, of the right bank Cossacks arose, Petro Doroshenko. This hetman tried many times to militarily unite the east and west banks of Ukraine, but alone stood no chance of doing so. Petro obviously disliked both the Poles and the Russians, and saw that the Ottoman Empire held the same feelings towards these two empires. The Ottomans were seen as the best alternative. Thus, Petro offered himself and his Cossack host as a vassal state to Mehmed IV, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. After an initial short war against the Poles, an independent Cossack state was recognized. But soon after, Petro faced a coalition of both Russians and Poles. During this war, both banks were able to be united for a short time, which itself inspired a vision of a united, independent Ukraine that spread amongst many regions. However, as the war went on, the hetman fared much worse due to various internal and political factors of his country and the Ottomans. This war ended with Petro surrendering and being exiled, Luckily though, the lands of the right bank of Ukraine were able to remain independent, despite the Ottomans rescinding their vassalage. However, without a strong power to back the tiny nations squeezed between empires, the Cossacks were doomed, and just before the time of Oleksa Dovbush, the Poles officially re-annexed the state. What followed was a crackdown upon the Ukrainian language, culture, and religion in governed areas, in attempts to curb further Ukrainian dissent. While this was successful in converting and replacing many Ukrainian nobles, the peasants largely remained angry, rebellious, and poor. During this time of instability and conflict, the Ruthenian voivodeship was often the main battleground between Polish and Cossack forces. Due to this, many Ukrainians made an arduous and expensive journey to the east to avoid the death, destruction, and cultural suppression of the region, factors that were yet to be present under Russia or the Cossack hinterland at the time. Yet, most did not have the resources to make this trip and had to stay, and of those that stayed, some of the poorest of society, seeing few alternatives, banded together in small groups called Opryshks, or Opryshky. This name's meaning is unclear, but probably means independent men. And these men would act as highwaymen, robbing nobility as they drove by in their carriages. But Opryshky were no strangers to robbing estates and local centers of wealth. The booty the Opryshky collected was primarily saved for themselves, but the bandits were also fond of reinvesting the funds into their local communities and villages, as their plights were mostly directed towards the people who seemed to hoard wealth and abuse power. These local communities were not always Ukrainian either, evidenced by the many linguistically diverse legends of the brigands and their feats. These myths can be seen in Jewish, Polish, Hungarian, and Moldavian folklore, to name a few, despite the richer counterparts of these groups being targets of the Opryshky. Evidence of this kind somewhat proves to us that the activities of the Opryshky were focused on the upper echelon of Polish-Lithuanian society, and not racially motivated as some claim. Opryshk resistance against their conditions did not end at the extent of their municipalities, as they too held greater dreams of Ukrainian liberation. To this end, these bandits were no strangers to participation in larger revolts, such as the Khmelnytsky Uprising and Pokutia Uprising. As their presence and purpose as freedom fighters and economic equalizers in Ukrainian Carpathia benefited the bottom of society, it is obvious that the peasantry looked upon the Opryshky very favorably. Finally, now we arrive at our focus, Oleksa Dovbush, who, as previously stated, was born in Pechenizhin. He found himself as part of one of the poorest classes in the region, as his family didn't even own their own home, and had not but a flock of sheep to their name. As he was very poor, not much is known about his childhood, but since Oleksa was of the Hutsal people, he most likely held great reverence for his religion, while partaking in the many pre-Christian cultural, artistic, and customary practices that had been retained by the Hutsals. Presumably, he would have spent his summers living semi-nomadically, while taking care of the family herd, by taking them from mountain meadow to mountain meadow. This is where Oleksa would have familiarized himself intimately with the mountain ranges, knowing them through and through. This environment of poverty and nomadic summers, while seeing the world around him suffer at the hands of a repressive government, is exactly why Oleksa became an Opryshk with his brother Ivan. Eventually, the brothers began their own band of Opryshky, based out of a hideout in the Chorna Hora mountain range, under the shade of the Stich Peak, and this band grew to about 50 members fairly quickly. Although after a year or so, the two brothers butted heads a little too much, and so Ivan decided to take his own path. Now Oleksa was left as the sole head of these Opryshky. Immediately, Oleksa Dovbush was recognized for his talent and skill, which he would hone over his career, perfecting banditry and everything that came along with it. For example, Oleksa's group of Opryshky were known to travel great distances, with tales of their exploits coming as far as the Lemko and Prikarpatia regions, albeit most of Oleksa's endeavors took place close to his home base. At some point during this time, Oleksa found himself a wife. Sadly, there is not much information known about her, beyond the fact that she in some way was part of the Opryshky. Whether that means she took part in the raids, or only tended to their hideout, is unsure. Oleksa's expertise began to shine through, as the raids he conducted were increasingly daring. They were of extremely high-value goods and targeted estates of very rich and powerful merchants, nobles, and landowners. However, the world around Oleksa stayed the same, cruel and unforgiving, especially for his people, who were treated as second-class citizens. A change needed to happen. Legends say that Oleksa used his skill to begin targeting nobles who treated the peasants beneath them with exceptional cruelty. Not only that, but Oleksa would give much of the wealth that he stole from these raids to the peasants under the thumb of said noble in recompense. Word spread about these actions quickly, and it would not be long before peasants would come to Oleksa in seek of his help. The bandit became a beloved figure in the region, instilling hope into the hearts of the people. Oleksa was so popular, and his feats were so well known, in fact, that his portrait was sold in markets at the time. As a result, there are many stories of Oleksa and his band being harbored by peasants in their homes to escape capture from the law. On top of that, Oleksa was known to take advantage of the Hutsal region's proximity to other nations by fleeing across borders when necessary, which helped him gain the reputation of being slippery and almost impossible to catch. In seeing the difference one group of Opryshky could make, Oleksa also inspired a new wave of people to take up arms and change their material conditions by becoming Opryshky themselves. Some famous Opryshky that became known followers of Oleksa during his career are Vasyl Bayurak, who is largely considered Oleksa's successor, and Ivan Boychuk of the Kolomia region, who went on to be part of the Haidamak uprisings. These high-profile thefts of Oleksa, the hope and defiance he inspired in the common folk, and the ease with which he evaded local authorities, garnered Oleksa the ire of high government officials in the Commonwealth. Józef Potocki, who was the military leader of the Kiev voivodeship, and trusted in the defense of Poland-Lithuania from potential Ottoman invasions, got himself entangled in the mess that was capturing the slippery Oleksa. However, even with 2,000 soldiers under him, the bandit and his men were able to stay just out of reach of Józef. Since the evasion of Polish forces was a forte of Dovbush for years, nobles offered their citizens the reward of exemption from feudal duties in return for the capture of Oleksa. Sadly, this led to the demise of Oleksa Dovbush in the town of Kosmach at the hands of Stefan Zwinchuk, another Opryshok like himself. Some versions of the story say that Stefan used his wife Dzvink as a spy, by letting Oleksa take her on as a mistress, while some stories do not mention Dzvink at all. Other legends say that because Oleksa took Dzvink on as a mistress, Stefan, out of anger, attacked Oleksa, and Stefan was not motivated by the noble's reward at all. Either way, Stefan shot Oleksa. Initially, the Opryshok leader used his most famous skill and was able to get away into a nearby forest, although the further he got, the more his wound drained his blood, until Oleksa Dovbush eventually collapsed. Some sources say that once it was found, the body of Oleksa Dovbush was cut up into several pieces and publicly displayed to instill a sense of fear in the locals, and hopefully discourage any further Opryshok activities. Yet, this had the opposite effect, and the Opryshok movement continued as strong as ever, and, in some places, their numbers even increased, as no other actions were taken to address the frustrations that caused young Ukrainians to rebel in the first place. The Opryshok movement was its most successful and popular during and immediately after the life of Oleksa Dovbush, as people were inspired by his resistance and success. Despite this fact, in the following years, taxes were raised, serfdom was maintained, and conscription was forced upon Ukrainians. This obviously did nothing to help the Polish in their attempts to suppress the Opryshky and the Ukrainian identity and longing for independence. During the time of Oleksa, the Haidamak movement was born in the east, but their main rebellions did not occur until the later years of and after the life of Oleksa. To avoid an unnecessary, lengthy tangent, the most simplified explanation I can give you of the Haidamak is that they had similar goals and frustrations to the Opryshky, but were more centralized in the Kiev voivodeship. Haidamak uprisings often had large contingents of Opryshky fighting alongside them. An example of such, I already mentioned, in the Opryshok, Ivan Boychuk and his men. Poland-Lithuania entered its downfall for many reasons, but partly due to the resistance of Ukrainians and radical instability that they caused in the Commonwealth. The fall of this empire led to Carpathian Ukraine being annexed by the Habsburgs in Austria as part of the partitioning of Poland. Under the Austrians, Ukrainians had increased economic opportunity, although Habsburg policies favored ethnic Poles, which maintained a lot of the inequality that inspired the Opryshky in the first place. Consequently, the Opryshky were able to maintain membership, even as rulers changed, since immediate landlords and individuals in positions of power remained the same. Eventually, policies were implemented that improved the lives of Ukrainians, and serfdom itself was abolished in Austria, which, in turn, led to the peaceful dissolution of the Opryshky movement. This dissolution did not come before the actions of the Opryshky were able to take hold of Ukrainian culture. Many famous Ukrainian poets, writers, and musicians captured the legendary Opryshky through their art and cemented the movement in Ukrainian history, despite the limited written records. Even under the Soviet Union, this moment of Ukrainian history was one of the few that was not illegal to mention, as the Soviets hijacked the history and made Oleksa a proto-communist by taking from the rich and giving to the poor, and not mentioning the societal change that he wanted. Regardless, the angle of the story that was Ukrainian liberation was never entirely lost upon Ukrainians, and even to this day, songs are sung about Oleksa Dovbush. And that was Oleksa Dovbush highlighted. Please like and subscribe if you liked the video, and if you have any comments or suggestions, leave them in the comment section below, or email me with my email in the description. I also started a Patreon if anyone is interested in supporting a small creator like myself.